The Picnic Basket Packed for Four, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Wasp That Did Not Sting. The scream came from the direction of the willow trees, and it silenced the brass band mid-bar. Miss Jane Marple, who had been sitting in a folding chair with a cup of lukewarm lemonade balanced on her knee, set the cup down very carefully in the grass. She was 70-something, and had learned long ago that the worst thing one could do in a crisis was to spill good lemonade. "That," said the vicar's wife beside her, "was Dolly Fenwick." It was. Dolly Fenwick came stumbling out from behind the willows with her hat gone crooked and both hands pressed to her mouth, and behind her, quite still on a tartan rug with a picnic basket open beside her, lay Mrs. Ottilie Vane. The Little Hexworth Horticultural Society's summer fete went on ringing with laughter for a full 30 seconds before the news reached the coconut shy, and then it stopped all at once, like a wireless switch-off. Miss Marple did not hurry. She never did. But she was among the first dozen people at the Willows, and what she saw there she filed away with the same neat, unhurried attention she gave to a difficult stitch in her knitting. Mrs. Vane lay on her back on the rug. Her face had gone a colour Miss Marple did not like at all, a sort of dusky plum, and her hand was still curled around the stem of a wine-glass that had tipped and emptied itself into the grass. Beside her, upright and undisturbed, sat the picnic basket, a good wicker one with leather straps, the kind Fortnums used to sell before the war, and it was still packed with sandwiches, a jar of pickled onions, a fruit cake wrapped in greaseproof paper, and 3 more glasses. 3 more glasses. Miss Marple counted them twice, out of habit, because numbers that did not agree with themselves always interested her. "Don't touch anything," said Colonel Fenwick, arriving at a trot with his moustache working. "Dolly, Dolly, what happened?" "I only went to fetch her a shawl," Dolly Fenwick said, in the high, thin voice of someone repeating a sentence to keep from screaming it. "She said she was cold, though it's the warmest day we've had all June, and I laughed and said so, and she said fetch it anyway, Dolly, there's a good girl, and I went, and when I came back, she could not finish." She did not need to. Dr. Haverford, who had been judging the vegetable marrows with an expression of profound boredom not 10 minutes before, now knelt by the body with quite a different expression altogether. He did not take long. "She's dead," he said, "and I don't like the look of it. Get everyone back, everyone, and somebody rings the police." Behind him, the fete went on trying, in its confused way, to remain a fete a little longer. Somewhere near the tea tent, a child was crying, because nobody would let her collect her hoopla prize now, of all moments, and the vicar's wife moved among the stalls with the brisk, useless kindness of a woman who did not know what else to do with her hands. Little Hexworth was not a large village, nor a particularly remarkable one. A high street with a butcher and a post office and Mr. Ives's nursery, a green where the cricket team lost more often than it won, a church with a square Norman tower that had watched over rather quieter Julies than this one for the better part of 800 years. It was the sort of place where the greatest excitement of an ordinary summer was a stray cow loose in the vicarage garden, and it did not, on the whole, know what to do with a dead woman under its willow trees. Miss Marple, who had lived in villages of exactly this kind for the whole of her long life, knew precisely what to do with them, though she would never have put it in quite so bold a fashion. One waited, one watched who moved first, and who moved last, and who did not move at all but only stood very still, as though moving might draw attention to something they would rather nobody noticed. The crowd obeyed the first instruction with more enthusiasm than the second, forming a loose, murmuring ring at a distance of 20 feet, as though Mrs. Vane's death might be catching. Miss Marple, small and grey, and entirely unremarkable in her flowered summer dress, was not asked to move, and so she did not. She looked instead at the picnic basket, and at the 4 glasses, one fallen and empty in the grass, 3 standing full and untouched inside the lid, and she thought, with the particular clarity that came to her at such moments, how very odd it was that a woman who had come to a fete quite alone should have packed a basket for 4. Chapter 2. A very full picnic basket. Inspector Craddock, no relation, he was at pains to explain to anyone who asked, to the Craddock who had solved the business at Chipping Cleghorn some years back, though he rather wished he were, since that Craddock had apparently had the good fortune to work alongside a Miss Marple whose reputation had reached even the county constabulary, arrived at Little Hexworth within the hour, dusty and irritable from the drive. He found a fete in ruins, a body removed to the mortuary van, and a great many people who had all, it seemed, been somewhere else at the crucial moment. "Cyanide," he said to his sergeant, reading from Dr. Haverford's hasty notes. "In the wine. Not much doubt about that. The smell alone. The question is who put it there, and when, and how they knew Mrs. Vane would be the one to drink it. Popular woman, was she, sir?" Craddock looked at the sergeant as though he had said something naive. "Chairwoman of the Horticultural Society for 11 years running. In my experience, Lewis, nobody is chairwoman of anything for 11 years without making enemies of everyone who ever wanted the job and didn't get it." The picnic basket sat now on a trestle table in the church hall, photographed from 6 angles, its contents catalogued with the grim thoroughness of a jumble sale inventory. 4 glasses, 4 linen napkins, monogrammed with a small OV in blue thread, sandwiches for 4, cucumber and potted meat, and a plate of egg and cress cut into neat triangles. A fruit cake large enough to serve 6 with tea to follow. "Whoever packed this basket," said Craddock slowly, "packed it for a party. Not for one woman sitting alone under a willow tree. Maybe she was expecting someone," Lewis offered. "Maybe she was expecting 3 someones," said Craddock, "and only one of them turned up to poison her, and the other 2 never came at all, or came and went before anyone noticed." Sergeant Lewis, a broad, patient young man, not yet cured of the belief that murder in a village must always be a simpler business than murder in a town, turned the fallen glass over in gloved hands, and frowned at it as though it might, if regarded sternly enough, simply tell him what he wished to know. "Funny sort of poisoner, sir. Packing a whole hamper just to kill one woman. Seems a deal of trouble to go to." "That's rather my point, Lewis. Either the hamper had nothing to do with the murder at all, and the poison went in by some quite separate means, which I doubt, given where that glass lay, or the hamper is the whole key to the thing, and we shan't understand this business until we understand why a woman packs sandwiches for 3 guests who, as far as we can presently discover, never sat down at her table at all." Craddock rubbed at his eyes, feeling, not for the first time that week, the particular fatigue of a case that seemed to offer a great many facts and precious little sense to bind them together. "Get onto the church hall committee, find out who was seen where between 1:30 and 1:45, and do it before memories start improving themselves overnight, the way they always do in these places once people have had time to talk it over among themselves." It was at this point that the vicar, the Reverend Mr. Aldous Pym, put his head round the church hall door with the particular apologetic cough of a man who does not wish to intrude but feels he must. "Inspector, there's a Miss Marple outside who wonders if she might have a word." She was, I believe, quite near the scene. Craddock had, in fact, heard the name before, from a colleague in another county who spoke of it in the tone men usually reserved for weather that had ruined a cricket match, with a kind of baffled respect. He said he would see her at once. Miss Marple came in, still carrying her knitting, a half-finished booty in pale blue wool, and sat where she was asked to sit with the composed patience of a woman who had spent a great many hours of her life waiting for kettles to boil and vicars to finish sermons. "I don't wish to take up your time, Inspector," she said, "but I did notice the glasses, 4 of them, and a basket packed, if I am not mistaken, for a party of 4, and yet Mrs. Vane came to the fete entirely alone. I saw her arrive at 2:30 in the little blue car, and there was no one with her." "You're quite sure of that?" "Oh, quite sure. One notices these things at my age, Inspector, when one hasn't very much else to notice." She smiled, faintly apologetic, as though this were a small failing rather than the precise and terrible attentiveness that had, on more than one occasion, hanged a murderer. And there is one more thing, though I dare say it is nothing at all. Mrs. Vane was not fond of pickled onions. I know this because she said so, quite firmly, at the Society's committee tea in May, when Mrs. Delacourt brought a jar to the sale table, and Mrs. Vane declined one with rather more feeling than the subject seemed to warrant. Craddock looked at the jar of pickled onions sitting on the trestle table, unopened, its lid still sealed. "Then why," he said slowly, "pack them in her own picnic basket?" "That," said Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, "is exactly what I have been wondering." Chapter 3. The Committee of Six. By evening, Inspector Craddock had a list. It was not a long list, as these things went. 6 names, each belonging to a member of the Horticultural Society's inner committee, the small governing body over which Ottilie Vane had presided for 11 years, with what several witnesses, choosing their words with the caution of people who did not wish to speak ill of the dead within 12 hours of her death, called a firm hand. There was Colonel Reginald Fenwick, the Society's treasurer, whose accounts, Craddock had already been told by no fewer than 3 separate villagers, wanted looking into. There was his wife Dolly, who had found the body, and whose distress seemed genuine enough, but whose reasons for going to fetch a shawl on the hottest day of June remained, to Craddock's mind, thin. There was Mrs. Iris Delacourt, whose pickled onions sat unopened and unexplained on the evidence table, and who had, it transpired, stood against Mrs. Vane for the chairmanship not 2 years before, and lost by a margin the whole village still discussed. There was Miss Beryl Hutton, secretary of the Society, a sharp-faced woman of perhaps 40, who kept the minute books with what one villager described admiringly as a memory like a filing cabinet. There was Mr. Walter Ives, who ran the seed and nursery shop on the High Street, and supplied the Society's flower show each year, and who had, Craddock's sergeant reported with some relish, been seen arguing with Mrs. Vane outside the church only the previous Thursday. And there was, lastly, a young man named Peter Vane, Ottilia's nephew, newly arrived in the village that spring to help with her garden, about whom nobody seemed to know a great deal at all, which in itself Craddock found interesting. 6 committee members, 4 glasses in a basket packed, it appeared, in Ottilie Vane's own kitchen that very morning, according to her daily woman, Mrs. Pruitt, who had seen the sandwiches cut and the cake wrapped before she left at 11. She said she was having a private little gathering at the fete, Mrs. Pruitt told Craddock, twisting her apron in her hands in the vicarage kitchen where the interviews were being conducted. "Not the whole committee, mind, just 3 of them," she said, though she wouldn't say which 3, and I didn't like to ask, seeing as it wasn't my place. Did she seem troubled? Frightened even? Mrs. Pruitt considered this with the slow honesty of a woman unused to being asked her opinion on anything. "Not frightened, sir. Pleased with herself, more like. She had a little smile on her all morning, the kind she got when she'd caught somebody out at something. She was a great one for catching people out, was Mrs. Vane. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain in the corner of the vicarage kitchen on the grounds that she had discovered the matter of the glasses and might, the vicar suggested delicately, notice other things besides, looked up from her knitting. "Mrs. Pruitt," she said gently, "did Mrs. Vane say anything else about her little gathering? Anything at all, however small?" Mrs. Pruitt frowned, trying to remember. "Only that she said, funny thing to say, now I think on it, she said, 4 glasses, Mrs. Pruitt, though there'll only be 3 of us drinking. One's for the ghost." "The ghost?" Craddock repeated. "That's what she said, sir, and she laughed when she said it. I thought it was one of her jokes. She had a queer sense of humour, did Mrs. Vane. God rest her." Miss Marple's needles had gone quite still. "One's for the ghost," she murmured. "How very interesting, and how very unkind." Chapter 4. Sandwiches for 3. It was Dr. Haverford's report, delivered to Craddock the following morning with the crisp satisfaction of a man who enjoyed being right, that narrowed the field considerably, and in doing so, widened Miss Marple's interest a great deal further. "The wineglass she drank from had cyanide in it," he said. "The other 3, untouched, are clean. So is the food. Sandwiches, cake, the lot. Whoever did this didn't poison the picnic. They poisoned one glass, and they knew, or gambled very heavily, that it would be the glass Ottilie Vane picked up. How could they be sure of that? Craddock asked. They couldn't, not with certainty. Unless, said Haverford, the glass was marked in some way, or handed to her directly, or she always sat in a particular place and reached for whichever glass was nearest. Miss Marple, who had been invited to sit in on this conversation with the tolerant bemusement Craddock now extended to her as a matter of course, cleared her throat. Inspector, might I ask, was the fallen glass nearest the willow trunk, or nearest the open field? Craddock checked his notes. Nearest the trunk. Why? Because, said Miss Marple, if Mrs. Vane arrived first and chose her own seat, as I believe she did, since she came alone in her car some 20 minutes before the fete was due to start, I saw her walking down to the willows with the basket herself, quite laden. Then she would very naturally have sat with her back against the tree, in the shade, and reached for the glass nearest to hand. Anyone who knew her habits, and who had a moment alone with the basket before her guests arrived, could have been almost certain which glass she would drink from. Which means someone was there before the other guests, Craddock said slowly. Someone who had the opportunity to doctor one glass and know it was hers. Or, said Miss Marple, someone who was never a guest at all, and never intended to be seen at the Willows in the ordinary way, but who knew Mrs. Vane's habits well enough to be quite confident of the result. That afternoon, Craddock interviewed the 3 committee members whose names, by a process of elimination based on who had been seen where during the crucial half-hour, seemed most likely to have been Ottilie Vane's intended guests, Mrs. Delacourt, Miss Hutton, and the Colonel. Iris Delacourt, a stout woman with a talent for offended dignity, denied any invitation whatsoever. Ottilie and I have not exchanged a private word in 2 years, Inspector, not since the chairmanship business, and I'll thank you to remember that I lost that election fair and square and have never made a secret of my feelings about it, which is a good deal more than some people in this village can say for themselves. Beryl Hutton, the secretary, was cooler and more careful. I had no idea Mrs. Vane meant to have guests at the Willows. She said nothing to me about any invitation. I was at the tombola stall from 2 o'clock until Mrs. Fenwick screamed. A dozen people can confirm it. Colonel Fenwick, when pressed, went a dull brick red and said that he had certainly not been invited to any picnic, that he had spent the relevant period judging the produce with Dr. Haverford, and that Craddock might ask the doctor himself if he doubted it, which Craddock, in fact, already had, and which the doctor had confirmed. 3 denials, 3 people who each claimed to have an alibi for the crucial half-hour, and not one of them admitting to being among the 3 guests Ottilie Vane had, according to her own Daily Woman, expected that afternoon. Somebody is lying, Craddock said to Miss Marple as they walked back through the churchyard in the long gold light of early evening, either about the invitation or about the alibi, or both. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, nobody at all is lying, Inspector, and that is the most interesting thing of all. Chapter 5. Onions and Old Scores. Before Craddock turned his attention to the Fenwicks, he thought it prudent to close off, properly and finally, the question of Iris Delacourt, whose denial of any invitation had been given so readily that he distrusted it on principle. He found her in her own back garden, deadheading roses with a viciousness that suggested the roses had done something to deserve it, and she received his renewed questions with the wounded patience of a woman who believes herself perpetually misjudged. I've told you already, Inspector, and I'll tell you again as many times as you like. I was at the tombola from 2 o'clock sharp until poor Dolly screamed the place down. Ask anyone. Ask Mrs. Pym. Ask the Latimer girl who was helping me count tickets. Ask the dozen people who came up to try their luck and complained that I didn't have a decent prize among the lot of them. Nobody doubts you were at the tomb, Mrs. Delacourt, Craddock said. I wonder, though, whether you might tell me a little more about your quarrel with Mrs. Vane, the chairmanship, 2 years ago. Mrs. Delacourt's shears stopped mid-snip. That's old history, Inspector, and none of your business, if I may say so. Murder has a way of making old history everyone's business." She sighed and set down the shears, and for a moment the offended dignity fell away from her like a coat shrugged off in a warm room. Very well, I stood for chairwoman, because I'd been on that committee 11 years and never once been asked to lead it, and I thought it my turn, and half the village agreed with me, or said they did to my face. And Ottilie Vane beat me by 4 votes. 4 out of a committee of 31, and do you know how she did it? She went round in the week before the vote and told 3 separate members, in the strictest confidence, that I'd been overheard saying unkind things about their gardens. Things I never said. I found out afterward, from Beryl Hutton of all people, who felt sorry enough for me to tell me the truth once the vote was lost, and it could no longer do either of us any good. That must have angered you a great deal. It did. It still does, if you want the plain truth of it, Inspector, and I'll not pretend otherwise now she's dead, because pretending never did anyone credit. But anger is one thing, and poison is quite another, and I was counting tickets at the tombola with the Latimer girl at my elbow the whole half hour, and nothing you can say will alter that. Miss Marple, who had accompanied Craddock as far as the garden gate and had been examining, with apparent idleness, a bed of delphiniums gone slightly to seed, spoke up at last. "Mrs. Delacourt, I wonder whether I might ask something quite different. Did Mrs. Vane ever, in all the years you knew her, speak of her own girlhood? Where did she grow up, or her people?" "Never willingly. She'd say she came from a good Hampshire family fallen on hard times, and leave it at that, and change the subject sharply if anyone pressed further. I always thought it odd, a woman so free with everyone else's business, and so close about her own. Except that once, years back, I told the inspector already, about her mother's pickling business, which slipped out of her one evening over sherry, and which she never mentioned again, and looked quite put out with herself for having said it at all, as I recall." "Thank you," said Miss Marple. "I think that is a very small thing, Mrs. Delacourt, but I believe it may turn out to be a rather important one." Chapter 6. The Shawl That Was Not Needed. Dolly Fenwick had not been questioned as closely as the others, on the reasonable grounds that a woman who has just discovered a body is generally granted a day or two's grace before being pressed on inconvenient details. But Miss Marple, calling at the Fenwicks' cottage the next morning with a jar of her own gooseberry preserve as an excuse, one always needed an excuse, in Miss Marple's long experience, and preserve was as good as any, found Dolly Fenwick alone, pale and glad, in the particular way of frightened people, of any company at all. "It was so very hot," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the small sitting-room with the air of a woman entirely uninterested in murder, "that I confess I was surprised to hear Mrs. Vane wanted a shawl." Dolly's hands, folding and unfolding a handkerchief in her lap, went still. So was I. I said as much to her. I said, "Ottilie, it's the warmest day we've had, are you sure?" And she said yes. "Fetch it anyway, it's in the car, the blue one on the back seat," and I went. Because one didn't argue with Ottilie. Not really, not if one wanted a quiet life. And the car was some distance away, I believe, down by the Lich Gate, where the Fete Committee had asked people to park. A good 5 minutes walk each way. I was gone perhaps 12 minutes altogether, because I stopped to speak to Mrs. Pym about the raffle on my way back. Dolly's voice had begun, very slightly, to shake. 12 minutes, Miss Marple. That's all it took. If I hadn't stopped to speak to Mrs. Pym, if I'd been quicker, I might have. My dear, said Miss Marple, with a gentleness that was not in the least performed, I do not think it would have made the smallest difference, and I think you know that, really, or you would not have said it in quite that tone. The person who put the poison in that glass did not do it while you were fetching the shawl. They could not have. It takes only a moment to tip something into a glass of wine, and Mrs. Vane was alone at the Willows for a good 20 minutes before the fete opened, quite unobserved by anyone, arranging her basket. The poison was almost certainly there before you ever left her side. Dolly stared at her. Then why send me away at all? That, said Miss Marple, taking up the last spoonful of preserve with evident satisfaction, is precisely the question, and I think it has a rather sadder answer than any of us have yet considered. I do not think Mrs. Vane wanted the shawl in the least. I think she wanted you gone from the Willows for those 12 minutes because she was expecting a visitor she did not wish you to see, one of her 3 guests. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, or perhaps someone who was never meant to be a guest at all, someone she wished to speak with quite alone before her other guests arrived, and whose presence she was, for whatever reason, ashamed of. Chapter 7. The Nephew from Nowhere. It was young Peter Vane whom Miss Marple went to see next, and it was young Peter Vane she confided to Inspector Craddock over tea in the vicarage garden that evening, who interested her most of anyone in the sorry business. He was perhaps 26, dark-haired, with the slightly too careful manners of a man determined to be liked in a place where he was not yet sure of his welcome. He had arrived in Little Hexworth in April, he told Miss Marple readily enough, to help his aunt with her garden, having come down in the world a bit after a business venture in Bristol failed. Ottilia Vane, it seemed, had taken pity on her late brother's son and given him a room and an allowance in exchange for his labour among her roses. She wasn't an easy woman to live with, he said, with the frankness of grief that has not yet learned to guard itself. But she was fair. I've no complaints, whatever people are saying. And what are people saying, Mr. Vane? He flushed. That I'm after her money, I suppose. That I came running the moment I heard she was comfortably off. It isn't true, or, well, it isn't the whole truth at any rate. I did know she was comfortably off. I'd be a liar to say I didn't think of it. But I came because she asked me, and because I hadn't anywhere better to go, and that's the truth of it too. Miss Marple, who had a great gift for making silence feel companionable rather than accusing, said nothing for a moment, and into that silence Peter Vane, as she had rather expected he would, put a little more than he had meant to. There was something odd about her, this last fortnight, he said. She kept going through an old tin box she had, letters and photographs and the like, up in her bedroom. I heard her at it late one night, crying, which wasn't like her at all. I never once saw Aunt Ottilie cry, not for anything. And then a few days ago she asked me the strangest question. She asked whether I remembered my father ever mentioning a sister. And did you? That's the thing. My father never had a sister, not that I ever knew of. I told her so, and she went very quiet and said, no, I don't suppose he would have, and that was all. I've thought about it since. I think she meant something by it, but I'm hung up if I know what. Miss Marple thanked him very kindly, and walked home along the churchyard path with her knitting basket over her arm, and an expression of such deep and private thought that the vicar, passing her on his bicycle, very nearly rode into the Lich Gate. Chapter 8. The Second Shock. The second shock, when it came 2 days later, arrived not as a death but as a disappearance, and it recast every theory Craddock had begun, cautiously, to build. Beryl Hutton, secretary of the Horticultural Society and keeper of its minute books like a filing cabinet, did not come down for breakfast at her lodgings on the Thursday morning, and when her landlady went up to knock, she found the room empty, the bed unslept in, and a note on the dressing table addressed to no one in particular, which said only, I cannot answer for what I did not do, but I am afraid of what will be said, and I have gone where I will not be found, until this is settled one way or the other. Craddock, informed of this at 8:30 over a cup of tea he did not finish, said several things about amateur detectives and frightened spinsters that he later regretted, and had every road out of Little Hexworth watched by 10. Miss Marple, informed of the same news by the vicar's wife at the identical hour, said only, oh dear, I had rather hoped she would stay and be sensible, and went on buttering her toast with an outward composure that concealed, Craddock suspected when he heard of it, a very considerable inward alarm. Beryl Hutton was found by tea-time, not fled at all in the sense Craddock had feared, but sitting quite calmly in the vestry of the church, where she had apparently spent the better part of the day thinking, with the minute books of the Horticultural Society open on her lap. I didn't run away, she told Craddock, with something of her old briskness returning now that she had been discovered. I only needed to think without being watched. and one cannot think in this village without being watched, Inspector, as I imagine you've noticed. I came here because it was quiet, and because I wanted to look through the minutes again, the old ones, from before Mrs. Vane's time, when my aunt was secretary. Your aunt, Constance Hutton. She held the post for 9 years before Ottilie Vane came to the village and took things over, one might say. There was a great deal of unpleasantness about it at the time, though it's 20 years past now and nobody remembers, or nobody who's still living remembers it as I do. Beryl Hutton's mouth had gone thin and hard. I did not poison Ottilie Vane, Inspector, but I will not pretend I am sorry she is dead, and I think it is time somebody in this village told you why, since it seems nobody else means to. Chapter 9. The Vicar Remembers. The Reverend Mr. Pym had been at Little Hexworth only 9 years. Not long enough, he was quick to say, to remember the business of Constance Hutton's removal from the secretaryship at first hand, but long enough, Miss Marple knew, to have absorbed a great deal of the parish's older gossip from his predecessor's widow, who lived still in a cottage by the green, and remembered everything that had ever happened in the village, with the terrible clarity of the very old and the very idle. Mrs. Aldous, my predecessor's widow, that is, not myself. We share the name by pure coincidence, and it causes no end of confusion at the post office. Mrs. Aldous told me the whole story once, over a rather too strong sherry at Christmas, the vicar said, settling into his study chair, with the pleased air of a man asked to be useful in a matter rather larger than parish accounts. She said Ottilie Vane arrived in this village in the fever of the early 30s, like a woman running from something, though nobody could ever say quite what. Charming, of course. Everyone agreed she was charming, in those early years, before the charm hardened into something a good deal less pleasant. She befriended Constance Hutton within a month of her arrival, called on her nearly every day, learned everything Constance knew about the society's workings, and then, when the moment came, used every scrap of it against her. Did Mrs. Aldous ever say anything of where Mrs. Vane came from before Little Hexworth? Miss Marple asked. Only that she was cagey about it, even then. She claimed a Hampshire family, the Marchants, fallen on hard times, genteel poverty, the sort that still commands respect in a village like this one, unlike the other kind. But Mrs. Aldous did say one curious thing, which I confess meant nothing to me until this week. She said Ottilie Vane spoke, very occasionally, and only when she'd had rather more sherry than was her habit, with the faintest trace of a West Country burr beneath the polish. Nothing Hampshire folk ever had, but something further west, Cornwall perhaps, or Devon. Mrs. Aldous always meant to ask her about it, and never quite dared. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. A West Country burr, she repeated softly. And Trewin, Inspector, as I believe I mentioned, is very particularly a Cornish name, not a Hampshire one at all. I begin to think Mrs. Vane spent a very great many years indeed practising a voice that was not her own, and that beneath it, when she was tired or frightened or had taken a little too much sherry at Christmas, the old one crept back in spite of everything she could do to stop it. You think she was training herself against her own history for 20 years, Craddock said, and it finally caught up with her regardless. I think, said Miss Marple, that a lie maintained so very long becomes, in the end, almost a second true thing. One comes to half believe it oneself, and is all the more wounded when the world threatens to remind one it was never quite true at all. I am beginning to feel rather sorrier for Ottilie Vane than I expected to, Inspector, which is not at all the same thing as excusing what she did to Constance Hutton, or to Grace Ives, or to anyone else who stood between her and the comfortable story she had built. A frightened woman can be every bit as cruel as a confident one, and sometimes a good deal crueler, because she has so much more to protect. Chapter 10. An old grievance freshly turned what Beryl Hutton told Inspector Craddock in the vestry that afternoon, and what Miss Marple, summoned at Craddock's own request, with an alacrity that would have startled his superiors, heard repeated an hour later over the same minute books, was a story a good deal older than the fete and a good deal sadder. 22 years before, Ottilie Vane had come to Little Hexworth a young widow of good family and considerable charm, and had, within 18 months, displaced Constance Hutton from the secretaryship of the Horticultural Society in circumstances that Beryl described, even now, with a bitterness undimmed by time. "My aunt built that society from nothing," Beryl said. "Every rosebed, every committee, every rule in that book was hers first. And Ottilie Vane came in with her London manners and her London money and made herself indispensable within a year, and then, when the old chairman died, she simply told the committee that my aunt's health was failing, that she couldn't manage the work any longer, and had her voted out before my aunt even knew a vote was being held. It broke her, Inspector. She never held her head up in this village again. She died 9 years later, and everyone said it was her heart, but I have always believed a good part of it was Ottilie Vane." "And you've nursed that grievance for 22 years, Craddock said, not unkindly, "and become secretary yourself under the very woman who ruined your aunt." "I took the post because I wanted to see the books," Beryl said, with sudden and startling honesty. "I wanted to know, once and for all, whether what she did to my aunt was fair or foul. And I found out, 3 years ago, going through the old accounts, that it was a good deal fouler than even my aunt ever knew." She opened the oldest of the minute books to a page marked with a slip of paper, and pointed. Miss Marple leaned forward and read, with the particular attention she gave to any column of figures that did not quite agree with itself, an entry recording a loan of £40 from the Society's Benevolent Fund to a Mrs. O. Vane in the spring of the very year Constance Hutton had been voted out, a loan that appeared nowhere in any subsequent year's accounts as repaid, and that had been, Beryl said, quietly written off 18 months later as an administrative error by a committee that Ottilie Vane herself, by then, controlled entirely. £40 was a great deal of money in 1932, Miss Marple said softly. Enough perhaps to matter a great deal to a young widow newly arrived in a village, with, I imagine, very little of her own. "That's what I always wondered," Beryl said, "where her money truly came from, before she married Colonel Vane. She let it be known she was from a good family fallen on hard times, but I never found a trace of any such family, not in all my looking, and 3 weeks ago I told her so. I told her I had the old books, and I meant to bring the matter before the full committee, family secret or no." "And what did she say?" Craddock asked. Beryl Hutton's face, for the first time, showed something that was not quite bitter. "She laughed at me, Inspector. She said, 'Go ahead, my dear, bring it before the committee, and see how much good it does you, because by the time you've finished, I shall have told them a thing or two about your own family that will make £40 look like nothing at all.' And then she wouldn't say another word, however I pressed her, only smiled that dreadful little smile of hers, as though she'd caught me out at something far worse than I'd caught her." Miss Marple's needles, Craddock noticed, had gone entirely still. Chapter 11. A glove left behind. It was Miss Marple's habit, whenever a matter troubled her past the point of comfortable sleep, to return to the scene of it in daylight and simply look, not for anything in particular, but in the general and patient hope that something would look back at her. She walked down to the Willows the next morning before the dew was properly off the grass, with Inspector Craddock, who had learned by now not to question these small excursions, walking beside her in respectful silence. The rug on which Ottilie Vane had died was long since removed, but the impression of it remained faintly pressed into the grass, a pale rectangle already greening over at the edges. Miss Marple stood at its foot for some time, looking not down at the ground but up into the branches, and then, quite suddenly, bent and drew from beneath a tussock of grass at the willow's root a single lady's glove, cream kid leather, rather fine, and entirely dry, though the ground beneath it was still damp from the previous night's shower. "Now that," she said, holding it up to the light, "is interesting. It has not lain here since the day of the murder, Inspector, or it should be a good deal more weathered than this, and it has not rained upon at all, though we have had 2 showers since Tuesday. Someone dropped this quite recently, yesterday I should think, or even this morning, which means someone has been down to the Willows since the police finished their examination and has not thought to mention it to anyone. Craddock turned the glove over in his hands. It was a small glove, well made, monogrammed inside the wrist in tiny embroidered letters. B.H. Beryl Hutton, he said slowly. I think we must ask her, gently, why she came back, said Miss Marple, though I suspect I can already guess a part of the answer. A woman who has just learned that her aunt was wronged 22 years ago by the very woman lying dead beneath this tree might well feel drawn back to the spot, Inspector, quite without any guilty motive at all. Grief and guilt so often look alike from the outside, and it is one of the great cruelties of an investigation like this one that innocent people are obliged to explain themselves as carefully as guilty ones, and often explain themselves a good deal worse, having had no practice at all in constructing a convincing account of their own movements. When they put the question to her that afternoon, Beryl Hutton did not deny it, and did not, this time, look afraid. I came back yesterday evening, she said, to stand where she died, and ask myself honestly whether I was glad of it. I am not proud of the answer, Inspector, but I will give it to you plainly. I felt nothing so simple as gladness. I felt only that a very great weight I had carried for a long time had shifted, without my having done anything at all to shift it, and that troubled me more than any grief could have done. I must have dropped the glove without noticing. I was not thinking of gloves. Did you see anyone else there, Miss Hutton? Anyone at all? She considered this with evident care. Only Dr. Haverford, walking back from a call at the Pritchard's farm along the footpath that skirts the Willows. He did not see me. I was standing well back, in the shadow of the trunk. But I remember thinking it strange that he should choose that path at all, when the lane is so much the shorter way home, and stranger still that he stopped, for a full minute or more, and simply stood looking at the ground beneath the tree before he went on. Miss Marple's needles, when Craddock reported this to her an hour later, went very still indeed, and stayed still for a long moment before resuming their steady, thoughtful click. Chapter 12. The Pattern in the Pickled Onions. It was that evening, walking once more through the churchyard with the low sun turning the gravestones gold, that Miss Marple stopped quite suddenly and said, "Inspector, I believe I have been thinking about this in quite the wrong order, and I am ashamed of myself for it, because it is really a very simple sort of unkindness, once one sees it plainly." "I wish I saw it plainly," Craddock said. "The pickled onions," said Miss Marple. I could not think why Mrs. Vane, who disliked them so particularly that she said so in front of the whole committee, should have packed a jar of them into her own picnic basket. And then I thought, but of course, she did not pack them for herself. She packed the whole basket, glasses and sandwiches and cake, for her guests, choosing each thing to please a particular person, the way a hostess does when she means to make someone feel especially welcome and singled out. The pickled onions were not for Mrs. Vane at all. They were for Mrs. Delacourt, who is exceedingly fond of them. I have seen her eat half a jar at a church supper without the smallest embarrassment. But Mrs. Delacourt denies any invitation at all. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and I begin to think she is telling the truth, and that is precisely what interests me." Mrs. Vane packed a basket meant to please 3 particular people. I would very much like to know what the sandwiches and the cake tell us about the other 2, Inspector, because I do not think either of them was quite what we have been assuming. And then, having packed it with such care, she told her own daily woman, quite gaily, that the 4th glass was for a ghost. "You think she meant someone specific?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that Ottilie Vane had discovered, or half-discovered, or come to fear the discovery of, some old fact about her own past. The very fact Miss Hutton threatened to expose before the committee, that her fortune and her family were not what she claimed. I think she had begun, in that last fortnight, going through old letters and asking her nephew strange questions about a sister his father never had. And I think, Inspector, that she meant her little picnic that afternoon not as an act of kindness to 3 guests at all, but as a trap, a trap she had set with great care and, I am sorry to say, a great deal of cruelty for one particular person, and that the other two invitations, if they were truly issued, were meant only to provide a public, innocent occasion on which the trap might be sprung without anyone suspecting what it really was. Then who was the trap set for? Miss Marple looked at him with an expression of genuine and troubled sorrow. I think, Inspector, we must ask Mr. Ives about his family, and quite particularly about his mother, and I am very much afraid that when we do, we shall find the whole sad business laid bare. Chapter 13. The Seedsman's Secret. Walter Ives. When Craddock called upon him at his nursery the following morning, among the rows of young dahlias he had been tending, with the absorbed care of a man who preferred plants to people, did not deny anything at all. He seemed, if anything, relieved to be asked. Born Grace Trewin in this county, and she died when I was 11, and my father remarried within the year, and never spoke of her again if he could help it. I grew up not knowing very much about her people at all, only that there had been some trouble, long before I was born, that nobody in the family cared to discuss. What sort of trouble? I didn't know myself, Inspector, until 3 weeks ago, when Ottilie Vane stopped me outside the church and asked, out of a clear sky, whether my mother had ever mentioned a sister who went away young and never came back. I said I didn't know of any such sister, and she looked at me the way a cat looks at something it means to play with for a while before it kills it, and said, "How very strange, because I believe I may be her." Craddock kept very still. "She told you she believed herself to be your mother's sister?" "She told me she'd been going through old letters of her late husband's. The Colonel had done some family research years back, tracing her own people, or so she'd always claimed, and had found something that troubled her greatly. A birth she couldn't account for, a name, Trewin, that matched nothing in the family she'd always believed was hers. She said she feared, that the comfortable story she'd told this village for 20 years about her good family and her modest inheritance might not be entirely true, and that if it wasn't true, then she might not be who she'd always claimed, and neither, perhaps, was I any relation of hers at all, but something rather stranger, a nephew, by a connection nobody had ever suspected." "And how did that make you feel, Mr. Ives?" Walter Ives looked at his dahlias for a long moment before answering. "Angry, Inspector, if I'm honest, though I'm not proud of it. Not because I wanted to be her relation. I'd never met the woman above a dozen times in my life, and never liked her particularly, but because she told it to me the way she told everything, as though she were doing me a kindness by troubling me with it, when really she only wanted to watch my face while she said it. That was Ottilie Vane all over. She liked to know things about people. She liked it better than almost anything. Did she say she meant to prove it, publicly? She said she meant to have it settled, one way or the other, and that she'd invited me to a private word at the fête to discuss how. I never went, Inspector. I want that understood plainly. I saw the crowd round the willows and thought better of it, and went home instead, and I've no one to prove that but my own wife, who'll tell you the same." Craddock made a note of this, though something in the seedsman's manner, an openness that seemed, if anything, to have grown rather than diminished under questioning, inclined him already to believe it. "One more thing, Mr. Ives. Did Mrs. Vane say anything of what she meant to do if the connection proved true? Whether she meant to acknowledge you publicly or provide for you in some way?" Walter Ives gave a short, unhappy laugh. "She never got that far, Inspector. Or if she had thoughts on it, she kept them to herself, the way she kept everything to herself until the moment came to use it. I sometimes wonder whether she even wanted it to be true. I think, now I've had time to turn it over, that some part of her rather relished the not knowing, the way a woman relishes a locked box she has decided not to open just yet, because the opening will change everything, and the not opening changes nothing at all. She was not, whatever else she was, a woman who liked things settled and done with. She liked them hanging, half-finished, so that she alone held the string." He bent back to his dahlias, and for a moment his hands moved among the young plants with the same absorbed tenderness Craddock had noticed on first arriving, as though the trouble of the last 3 weeks could, for a little while at least, be set aside among things that asked nothing of a man but water and patience. "I'll tell you the truth, Inspector, since we're being truthful," he added, not looking up. "I've thought once or twice, this past week, that whoever did kill her did the whole village something of a service, wicked as that is to say aloud. I'm not glad she's dead, but I can't pretend I'm sorry the not knowing died with her either, because I don't believe she ever meant to let me know for certain, only to keep me wondering, the way she kept half this village wondering about one thing or another, for the pure pleasure of watching us wonder." Chapter 14. 4 Names for 4 Glasses. That evening, in the vicarage sitting room, over a pot of tea that had gone cold from neglect, Miss Marple laid the matter out for Inspector Craddock, with the quiet, orderly satisfaction of a woman putting a difficult piece of knitting finally to rights. "I believe," she said, "that we now understand the basket, Inspector, and I confess it makes rather a sad little picture, once assembled. 4 glasses, 1 for Mrs. Vane herself, 1, I believe, for Mrs. Delacourt, packed with pickled onions to please her, not, I think, out of any real affection, but because Mrs. Vane wished to have a witness present, someone whose enmity was old and well known, and utterly beside the point, so that if anyone later asked what the gathering had been about, she might say, 'Oh, only committee business. Iris and I were patching up an old quarrel,' and be believed. A little piece of stage dressing, if you like. And the 3rd glass? The 3rd, I think, was meant for Mr. Ives, whom she had genuinely invited, meaning to confront him, or confide in him, perhaps she hardly knew which herself, with what she had found among her husband's papers. And the 4th glass, the one she called the ghosts, was for no living guest at all. I believe it was set out, quite deliberately, as a kind of grim little joke to herself, a glass for the sister who vanished, the Trewin girl she now feared she might, in some fashion, actually be. She meant it, I think, as a private piece of theatre, playing at confession before she had entirely decided whether to confess. Craddock frowned. "Then who poisoned the glass she actually drank from?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is the question I have been turning over most carefully, and I believe the answer lies not with Mrs. Delacourt, who never came, nor with Mr. Ives, who also never came, but with someone who knew of the invitations without being one of the 3 invited guests at all, someone who had every reason to fear exactly what Mrs. Vane meant to reveal that afternoon, and who arrived early, while Mrs. Vane sat alone arranging her basket, in those 20 unwatched minutes before the fête began." "You mean Peter Vane?" "I mean," said Miss Marple gently, "that I think we must ask ourselves what it would mean to a young man newly arrived in this village, dependent entirely on his aunt's goodwill and her promised inheritance, to learn that his aunt was on the very point of publicly unravelling the story of her own birth, a story that, if it came undone, might undo a great deal else besides, including perhaps any claim he had upon her estate at all, should it transpire that Ottilie Vane's fortune had never rightfully been hers to leave to anyone, being founded, as Miss Hutton's old ledger suggests, upon money quietly taken and never repaid, and an identity quietly borrowed and never truly earned. "You think Peter Vane knew what she'd found?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that a young man who lay awake and heard his aunt weeping over an old tin box, and who was asked outright whether his father had a sister, is not a young man who remains entirely in the dark about what troubles her, however innocently he answered when we asked him. I think he understood a great deal more than he told us, Inspector, and I think the time has come to ask him rather more directly." Chapter 15. A Test Over Tea. But it was not, in the end, a direct question that unravelled the matter. Miss Marple had never much cared for direct questions, having found in a long life that people lied to direct questions with great fluency and told the truth, quite by accident to gentle ones. But a small trap of her own devising laid the following afternoon in the vicarage garden, where she had asked the vicar's wife to arrange, with a great show of innocent hospitality, a tea to which Peter Vane, Dolly Fenwick, Beryl Hutton, and Inspector Craddock were all separately invited. None of them told who else would attend. "I thought," Miss Marple said to Craddock beforehand, "that it might be interesting to see how Mr. Vane behaves in company that includes Miss Hutton, who alone among us knows the full truth of the old ledger and the £40, and to mention, quite casually, that the minute books have been handed over to you for safekeeping, and that a search is being made through the county register for any record of a Trewin birth that might confirm or deny what Mrs. Vane believed about her own parentage. I would like to see his face when he hears it, Inspector, because a young man who already knows the answer will look quite different from one who is hearing it fresh." The 4 guests arrived within minutes of one another, and each, on discovering the others already assembled, produced a small, involuntary flicker of surprise that Miss Marple noted with quiet interest before it was smoothed away beneath ordinary good manners. Peter Vane came in sunburnt from the garden, still in his working clothes, apologizing for his appearance with the particular awkwardness of a young man unused to formal invitations. Dolly Fenwick arrived pale and overdressed, as though she had put on her second-best hat for courage rather than occasion. Beryl Hutton came last, precisely on time, carrying herself with the careful composure of a woman determined not to be caught out again, as she had been over the glove. The vicar's wife, briefed only to the extent of being told that Miss Marple wished for a pleasant little gathering, nothing more, presided over the teapot with a serenity that would have been entirely convincing had anyone present been paying the smallest attention to her rather than to one another. The lawn had been mown that morning, and the smell of cut grass mingled with the sweetness of the Victoria sponge, and for the first quarter-hour the conversation ran along exactly the channels such conversations always ran along in Little Hexworth: the unseasonable warmth, the sad state of the roses this year, whether the flower show ought to go ahead at all given everything that had happened, and whether it would seem heartless to hold it or heartless to cancel it, the village apparently unable to settle which particular species of heartlessness it most wished to avoid. The tea proceeded, on its surface, exactly as such teas do: cucumber sandwiches, and a Victoria sponge, and careful conversation about the weather and the flower show's uncertain future now that its chairwoman was gone. It was Miss Marple herself, over the second cup, who mentioned, with the mildest possible interest, that Inspector Craddock had been kind enough to explain how such registry searches were conducted, and that a result was expected within the week. Peter Vane's hand, lifting his cup, stopped a half-inch from his lips, and did not move for a moment that was, to Miss Marple's practised eye, exactly 1 moment too long. "I don't see what a registry search could tell anyone now," he said, and his voice, though light, had gone very slightly careful, the way a man's voice goes when he is choosing each word before he lets it out. "My aunt is dead. Surely whatever she believed, or didn't believe about her own family, died with her." "Oh, but that is exactly what makes it so interesting," said Miss Marple, with the bright, guileless enthusiasm of an elderly woman enjoying a puzzle. "You see, Mr. Vane, if it turns out that your aunt was correct, that she was indeed born a Trewin, and not who she always claimed, then a great many things might follow. Her whole fortune, for instance, founded as it partly was, I understand, on money never rightfully repaid to this very society, might be subject to all manner of legal difficulty. Her will might even be challenged, on the grounds that an estate built upon a stolen identity is not quite so simply inherited as we might wish. It would be a dreadful complication for whoever stood to benefit from it, would it not?" The silence that followed was not long, but it was very complete. Dolly Fenwick looked from Miss Marple to Peter Vane, and back again, with the dawning horror of a woman realizing, too late, what kind of tea party she had actually been invited to. Beryl Hutton set down her cup with great care, as though afraid it might shatter in her hand. "You think I killed her?" Peter Vane said at last, very quietly, "to stop her finding out the truth and to keep the money clean." "I think," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, "that you knew a great deal more than you told the inspector, and that a young man in your position, newly arrived, dependent, with a great deal to lose and very little claim on anyone's mercy should the whole ugly business come out, might have felt himself very sorely tempted indeed. Chapter 16. What the Ghost Glass Knew. I didn't kill her. Peter Vane's voice had steadied, and there was something in his face now that looked less like guilt than like exhaustion, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a secret so long that being asked to set it down at last comes almost as a relief. I'll tell you what I know, and you may believe it or not as you like, but it's the truth, and I'm tired of not saying it. He set down his cup. I overheard her, that last fortnight, going through the old tin box, and I did hear her weeping, and when I asked her what troubled her, she told me, not all at once, but a little each evening, the way people do when they're working up to something. She told me she'd found, among my uncle's old research papers, a record that troubled her greatly, a birth register entry for an Ottilie Trewin, born the same year and in the same parish as the woman she'd always believed herself to be, a woman named Ottilie Marchant, whose own birth she could no longer find any trace of at all. She began to fear that somewhere, many years ago, as a very young woman with no family and very little money, she had taken up the name and the modest little inheritance of a Marchant cousin who had died abroad and never been properly identified, and had built the whole of her later life, her marriage, her standing in this village, upon a theft so old and so successful that she herself had half forgotten it was a theft at all, until the papers brought it back to her. And you believed her? I didn't know what to believe, but I saw how it frightened her, and I understood well enough what it might mean for me, if it came out, that whatever she left me might be challenged, might be nothing at all, once lawyers got hold of it. I won't pretend that thought didn't cross my mind, Miss Marple, because you'd know I was lying if I said it hadn't. But I didn't poison her glass. I wasn't at the Willows before the fete opened. I was in the church hall the whole of that morning, helping set up the trestle tables for the production show, and Dr. Haverford himself will tell you so, because he was cursing at me the entire time for putting the marrows in the wrong order. Craddock, checking his notes with a frown, found that this was, in fact, precisely true, and had been confirmed already, quite independently, by 3 separate witnesses, whose statements he had simply failed to connect to the 20 unwatched minutes at the Willows, because nobody had thought to ask a question so particular as where Peter Vane had been between 1:30 and 1:45. Then who, said Craddock slowly, was at the Willows at that time? It was Beryl Hutton who answered, and her voice, when it came, was very small. I was, she said. I went to speak to her before the fete opened, quite alone, because I couldn't bear to wait any longer to know what she meant to do about the old ledger. I found her arranging the basket. We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, and then I left her, still alive, still perfectly well, arranging her wine glasses on the rug. And I have not told you this before, Inspector, because I was afraid, God forgive me, of exactly what you are thinking now. Chapter 17. The Woman Who Was Not There. A long silence followed Beryl Hutton's confession, broken only by the small, ordinary sounds of the vicarage garden, a wood pigeon somewhere in the elms, the distant clatter of the vicar's wife clearing the tea things, sounds that seemed, to Craddock, almost indecent in their calm continuation, while 5 people sat frozen around a table, each privately wondering which of the others might, after all, be capable of murder. Dolly Fenwick had gone very white. Peter Vane's jaw was set hard, as though he were holding some retort behind his teeth by the main force. It was Miss Marple, in the end, who broke the silence, and she did it, as she did most things, without any great drama at all. But Miss Marple, who had been watching Beryl Hutton's face throughout this confession with the close, unhurried attention she gave to a suspect stitch, shook her head very gently. I do not think you poisoned that glass either, my dear, she said, though I understand entirely why you were afraid to say you had been there. You have told us a great many true things this past week, at real cost to yourself, and I have come to believe you tell the truth even when it does you no credit, which is, in my experience, a very much more reliable habit than any alibi. No, I think there is one person in this whole sad business whom none of us has properly considered, because she was, in the plainest sense, not there at all, and that absence, I confess, is the very thing that has troubled me from the first afternoon, though I did not see clearly why until this moment." She turned to Dolly Fenwick, who went very white. "You told me, my dear, that you left Mrs. Vane at the Willows to fetch a shawl from the car, a shawl she did not in truth need, on the warmest day of the summer, and you told me you were gone for some 12 minutes because you stopped to speak with Mrs. Pym about the raffle on your way back. But Mrs. Pym, when the inspector's sergeant took her statement 2 days ago, said only that she exchanged a brief good afternoon with you near the Lyche Gate, lasting no more than a minute, nothing at all resembling a proper conversation about a raffle. I have been wondering ever since where the other 11 minutes of your absence truly went." Dolly Fenwick's hands, still folding and unfolding her handkerchief, had begun to shake in earnest. "You went to the car for the shawl, I think, exactly as you said," Miss Marple went on, very gently now, for she took no pleasure whatsoever in this part of the business. "But on your way back, I believe you did not go directly to the Willows. I believe you went, instead, to find your husband, the Colonel, because you had learned, perhaps from Mrs. Vane herself, in one of her cruel little confidences, for she did so love to know things about people and let them know she knew, that the Society's treasury accounts, which your husband kept, were a good deal further out than the mere carelessness he had always claimed, and that Mrs. Vane meant to have them properly audited that very week, now that Miss Hutton's old ledger had put her in a mood to have every account in the Society's history examined afresh." Colonel Fenwick, who had said almost nothing throughout the whole of the tea, went, if it were possible, several shades redder than his habitual complexion, and set down his cup with a hand that was not quite steady. Chapter 18. The Colonel's Confession. "I never poisoned her," Colonel Fenwick said, in the strangled voice of a man who has been dreading a sentence for days, and finds, now it has arrived, that he cannot make his mouth form the denial fast enough. "Whatever else you believe in me, Inspector, believe that. I am a fool, and I have been a fool with the Society's money for the better part of 3 years, borrowing a little here and a little there against my own pension when the harvest went badly, always meaning to put it back, and never quite managing it. But I never harmed a hair of Ottilie Vane's head, and I'll swear to that on anything you like." "But you did go to the Willows," Miss Marple said, "before the fête opened." "I did." The Colonel's shoulders sagged, and something in him seemed almost to loosen with the admission, the way a man loosens when a wound long hidden is finally shown to the light. "Dolly came to find me at the produce tent. She'd heard, from Ottilie's own mouth, not an hour before, that an audit was coming, and Ottilie had told her quite plainly, in that way she had, smiling the whole while, that she thought it a great shame a man of my standing should be brought so low over a few £100, but that the Society's rules were the Society's rules, and she couldn't be seen to make an exception for a friend, however fond of him she was. Dolly was half out of her mind with worry for me, and I went straight to the Willows to beg Ottilie to give me a little more time, a month, 6 weeks, long enough to sell a field and put the money back before anyone needed to know at all." "And did she agree?" The Colonel's mouth twisted. "She laughed at me, Miss Marple. Not unkindly, or so she seemed to think. She patted my arm and said she was sure it would all come right in the end, and poured me a glass of wine from her basket to steady my nerves, and told me not to be so gloomy on such a fine afternoon. I drank it, standing there beside her, thanked her for nothing at all, really, and went back to the produce tent no better off than when I'd left it, to find Haverford waiting to start the marrow judging. I never touched her wine glasses beyond the one she handed me herself, and I certainly never put anything in any of them. I hadn't the means, even had I the will. I carry nothing about me that could do such a thing, and you may search my house from attic to cellar if you doubt it." Craddock, watching Miss Marple's face throughout this halting confession, saw something shift there. Not surprise, but a kind of sorrowful confirmation, as though a stitch long suspected of being wrong had finally, upon close inspection, proved to be exactly as wrong as feared. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder whether we might ask Dr. Haverford to join us after all. I think he has rather more to tell us about that morning than he has yet had occasion to say." Chapter 19. The Doctor's Ordinary Habit. Dr. Haverford came to the vicarage garden with the faint irritation of a busy man interrupted twice in 1 week over the same tiresome business, and sat where he was asked to sit with the air of someone who expected to be gone within 10 minutes. "I've told the inspector everything I know," he said. "I judged the Marrows with the colonel from 1:30 until we were called to the Willows. I can't think what more you'd have me say." "Only a small thing, Doctor," said Miss Marple, "though I think it may prove the largest thing of all. You carry, I imagine, a doctor's bag with you to every village function, as a matter of habit. One never knows when a wasp's sting or a fainting fit might require attention, and I imagine that bag contains, among its ordinary contents, a certain quantity of medicinal compounds that a country practitioner keeps on hand for use against, among other things, certain agricultural pests, wasps' nests, rats in the barn, and the like. Potassium cyanide, in small and carefully measured quantities, is not a very uncommon thing for a doctor in a rural parish to carry, is it, for just such purposes?" Haverford's face had gone very still. "It is not unheard of," he said carefully, "but it is kept locked and accounted for, and I resent the implication that—" "I imply nothing whatsoever against you personally, Doctor," said Miss Marple, with a mildness that somehow made the words land harder than any accusation could have done. "I only wonder whether your bag was, at any point that morning, left unattended near the produce tent, where a great many people passed to and fro all through the judging, including, I believe, both Mrs. Fenwick, on her way to fetch the shawl and finding her husband instead, and the Colonel himself, in some considerable distress of mind, and possibly others, whom none of us has yet thought to ask." "It was left on the trestle table for perhaps 20 minutes, Haverford admitted slowly, "while I walked the rows with the Colonel and the judging committee. Anyone might have gone through it. I never imagined, one doesn't imagine such a thing, in a village fete." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "one never does until one is obliged to. And that, I think, Doctor, is exactly why this whole sad business has taken the shape it has, because everyone concerned assumed, quite reasonably, that a poisoning must have been planned with great care and secrecy by someone with a fixed and burning motive, when in fact I begin to believe it was something very much sadder and very much smaller, an act seized upon in a moment of sudden opportunity by someone who had not planned to kill at all until the means for it lay, quite unlocked, upon a trestle table not 20 yards from where Ottilie Vane sat laughing at another person's misfortune. Chapter 20. The Locked Cabinet. Before the tea party in the vicarage garden that would, in the end, unravel the whole sad business, Inspector Craddock had spent a quiet morning going through Dr. Haverford's dispensary with the doctor's own reluctant permission, and it was this, quite as much as anything said over the teacups, that had already begun to point him, though he did not yet fully understand where it pointed, toward the truth. The dispensary was a small, orderly room behind the surgery, its shelves lined with brown bottles each labelled in the doctor's own careful hand, and at the back, in a cabinet that was in principle always kept locked, sat a modest store of the more dangerous preparations a country practice required. Strychnine for vermin, a little morphia for the worst of his patient's pain, and a small tin, half empty, of potassium cyanide, used, as Haverford had said, against wasps' nests in the church tower and the occasional infestation of rats at the home farm. The cabinet was locked the whole of that week, as far as I know, Haverford had told Craddock at the time, with what had seemed then entirely genuine puzzlement. "I keep the key on my own ring. Nobody else has access to it." But Craddock, counting the tin's contents against the doctor's own dispensary ledger, for Haverford was, in every other particular, a scrupulously careful record-keeper, found a discrepancy of perhaps half an ounce, unaccounted for by any entry, dated to a period some 10 days before the fete. I hadn't noticed, Haverford said, when shown the ledger, and his surprise, Craddock recalled afterward, had seemed real enough at the time, real enough, indeed, that Craddock had very nearly crossed the doctor off his list of possibilities altogether, reasoning that a man who kept such careful books was unlikely to have made so careless a theft from his own stores without noticing the gap for a fortnight. It was Miss Marple, hearing this small detail repeated to her that same afternoon, who had turned it over with particular care. "I wonder, Inspector," she had said, "whether it is not the very carefulness of the doctor's records that ought to interest us most, rather than the gap in them. A careless man forgets to write things down. A careful man who fails to record something has very often chosen not to record it, and chosen, moreover, with the specific intention that the omission should look, to anyone examining his books afterward, exactly like carelessness." Craddock had thought this, at the time, a rather fanciful piece of reasoning, and had said so, but he had not forgotten it, and when Dr. Haverford broke at last in the vicarage garden and confessed the whole matter of the missing half-ounce, measured out with his own hand 10 days before the fete, not in a moment of sudden passion at all, he now admitted, but prepared and carried in his bag for over a week, awaiting only an opportunity he had told himself, quite sincerely, he never truly meant to use. Craddock understood, with a certain grim satisfaction, that Miss Marple had seen the truth of the man's character in the very orderliness of his ledger, long before either of them had any notion who the ledger truly belonged to. "I did not act on a sudden impulse, as I let myself believe when first you asked me," Haverford admitted quietly, in that same long evening's confession that would follow shortly after. "I had been carrying the means for over a week, telling myself it was only prudence, only a doctor's habit of preparedness against the wasp's nest in the belfry that the sexton had been complaining of since June. I think, if I am honest with myself at last, that some part of me had already decided, long before that morning, that I would use it if the chance ever came, plainly enough that I need not examine my own reasons too closely. The chance came at the Willows, with Ottilie Vane's back half turned, and her laughter still hanging in the air over the Colonel's misery, and I did not hesitate for even a moment, because I had already, in every way that mattered, hesitated quite enough in the 10 days before. Chapter 21. The Trap. Sprung Inspector Craddock had by now sent his sergeant to fetch one more person to the vicarage garden, and it was as the church clock struck 5 that Iris Delacourt arrived, flustered and indignant at being summoned yet again, demanding to know what more anyone could possibly want of her when she'd told the inspector 3 times over that she had never received any invitation to any picnic and had spent the whole of the crucial half-hour at the tombola stall, as a dozen witnesses would confirm. "I believe you entirely, Mrs. Delacourt," said Miss Marple, "about the tombola stall, but I wonder whether you would tell us again, quite precisely, what passed between yourself and Mrs. Vane at the committee tea in May, when you brought a jar of pickled onions to the sale table and she declined one. You said, I believe, with rather more feeling than the subject seemed to warrant." Iris Delacourt's indignation faltered, just slightly. "It was nothing. She said she couldn't abide pickled onions, and I said that was odd, considering, and she went quite sharp with me and changed the subject." "Considering what, Mrs. Delacourt?" There was a long pause. "Considering," Iris Delacourt said at last, reluctantly, "that her own mother, or the woman she always called her mother, at any rate, back when she first came to the village, and used to talk more freely about her girlhood before she grew so careful about it, had kept a little pickling business, of all things, out Cornwall way. She let that slip once, years ago, quite early on, and never mentioned it again after, and I always thought it odd, a woman of her supposed family background having a mother in trade. I didn't think of it again in 20 years, until that day at the tea, when I said it just to needle her a little, if I'm honest, because she'd been so high-handed about the whole flower show arrangements that spring. I never thought it would matter to anyone." Miss Marple's eyes had gone very bright. "Cornwall," she said softly, "and Trewin is a Cornish name. is it not, Inspector? I believe we shall find, when the registry search is complete, that Ottilie Vane's fears were entirely justified, that she was born plain Ottilie Trewin, daughter of a Cornish pickle seller, and became, through some early and desperate deception, involving a dead cousin's name and a small inheritance nobody was left to claim, the Ottilie merchant who later married a colonel and ruled a horticultural society for 11 years with a firm and unforgiving hand. And I believe that fear, the fear of being unmasked as exactly the kind of person she had spent her whole life despising and excluding from her own good opinion, was the true engine of everything she did in her last fortnight of life. The tears over the tin box, the cruel little confidences to Miss Hutton and Mr. Ives and the Colonel, and the strange, theatrical picnic she packed for guests who were never truly meant to enjoy it, but only to be tested and tormented in turn, each in their own private half-hour, by a woman who could not bear to face her own history alone, and so chose, instead, to make everyone around her suffer a little of it with her. Chapter 22. A quiet confession over the marrows. It was Dr. Haverford in the end who broke, and he broke not under any direct accusation from Miss Marple or Inspector Craddock, but under the simple, patient weight of her silence, as they sat together in the vicarage garden, while the evening light grew long and gold across the lawn. "I didn't plan it," he said at last, very quietly, into a silence nobody else had been willing to fill. "I want that understood above everything else. I am not a murderer, whatever this makes me now." He told it slowly, and without excuse, the way an honest man tells a shameful thing once he has finally decided to tell it at all. He had gone to fetch a bottle of iodine from his bag during the judging, he said, and had overheard, quite by accident, Ottilie Vane's conversation with the Colonel at the Willows not 5 minutes before, her light, amused cruelty, her refusal to grant him even a few weeks' grace, her evident pleasure in watching a decent, foolish man squirm before her. And something in him, hearing it, had remembered, with sudden and total clarity, a very much older cruelty. His own sister, dead now 11 years, whom Ottilie Vane had once, in the society's earliest days, publicly humiliated over a debt of her husband's far smaller than the Colonel's, driving the family into a shame from which his sister, delicate and proud, had never entirely recovered before her early death. "I had never told a soul in this village that Grace was my sister," he said. "We were estranged by the time she died, over a foolish quarrel about our father's will that seems, now, almost too small to have mattered at all, and I never spoke of the connection after I came here, because I found I could not bear the sympathy of people who had known her only as poor Grace Ives. The woman Ottilie Vane broke over £40 she never truly owed the society at all. I changed my practice from Dorset to this county quite deliberately 12 years ago, so that I might be near where she was buried without anyone asking why a stranger tended a grave in the corner of their churchyard every month without fail. I told the sexton it was an old family friend. He never pressed further. Nobody in a village presses further, if you give them a story plausible enough to hang their curiosity on, and I had a great deal of practice by then in giving people exactly such stories. He looked down at his own hands, folded in his lap, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. I used to walk past Ottilie Vane at the flower show and the church fete and the Christmas bazaar, year upon year, and shake her hand and admire her roses, and never once let her see what I carried. I told myself that was strength. I told myself Grace would have wanted me to bear it quietly and do no harm. And then I stood behind that trestle table on Tuesday and heard her speak to the Colonel in exactly the voice I remembered her using to my sister at a committee meeting in 1938, light and amused and utterly without mercy. And something that had been strength for 12 years simply stopped being strength at all in the space of perhaps 40 seconds and became something else instead. Miss Marple went very still. "Grace Ives," she repeated. "Walter Ives's mother." "My sister," Haverford said, and something in his controlled voice cracked at last. I watched Ottilie Vane torment the Colonel exactly as she had once tormented Grace, over exactly the same kind of small, forgivable debt, with exactly the same light and merciless amusement, and something in me simply gave way. I had the means in my bag, not 10 yards distant. I measured out what I judged sufficient, in less time than it takes to tell it, and I walked to the Willows while she sat alone finishing her arrangements, and I told her I had brought her a fresh glass, as the sun had warmed the wine standing in the old one, and she thanked me and drank it without the smallest suspicion, because why should she ever suspect the quiet doctor who came each year to judge her marrows, and had never, in 11 years, said an unkind word to her in his life? And then I went back to the produce tent, and I judged the marrows, and I have not slept a whole night since. Chapter 23. What the basket meant it. Was Miss Marple who, gently, finished the sad accounting for them all, once Dr. Haverford had been led away by Inspector Craddock's sergeant, and the vicarage garden had fallen quiet again in the last of the light. The others had gone too by degrees, Peter Vane walking Dolly Fenwick home along the churchyard path with the careful courtesy of two people newly and unexpectedly bound together by a shared fright, Beryl Hutton alone with her minute books once more, though she carried them now, Craddock noticed, rather less like a weapon and rather more like an inheritance she had finally been permitted to accept. Only Craddock himself remained, turning his empty teacup slowly in his hands and looking, for the first time since he had arrived in Little Hexworth, entirely at a loss for where a policeman's certainties ought properly to end and an old woman's understanding of human sorrow ought to begin. "I confess, Miss Marple," he said at last, "I came into this business looking for a motive sharp enough to hang a man on, and I find myself instead with a great deal of pity and precious little satisfaction, which is not at all what the job usually leaves a man with." "No," she agreed. "It very rarely does when one has looked closely enough. That is, I have always thought, the chief difficulty of my small hobby, Inspector. One begins wanting only to see clearly, and ends by seeing a good deal more than one bargained for, and none of it comforting. I do not think any of us feels a great deal of satisfaction in this, Inspector," she said, taking up her knitting once more, though her needles moved slowly, without their usual brisk certainty. "It is a very sad kind of murder, when one comes to examine it closely, not born of greed or of any long and careful plot, but of an old grief suddenly reawakened by a small, ordinary cruelty repeated in front of the wrong witness on the wrong afternoon. Dr. Haverford did not set out that morning to kill anyone. He set out to judge marrows. And Ottilie Vane, who had spent her whole life so afraid of being found out as something less than she claimed, was undone, in the end, not by the secret itself, but by the very habit of unkindness she had built to protect it. A habit so old and so constant that she used it on the Colonel without a second thought, never dreaming that the ears listening at the Willows that morning belonged to a man who had loved and lost someone she had broken in exactly the same careless way 20 years before. "And the basket?" Craddock asked. "The 4 glasses? Was any of that truly meant, or was it only, as you said, a piece of theatre?" "I think it was both," said Miss Marple. "I think Ottilie Vane, in that last fortnight, genuinely wished to confess something to somebody, to Mr. Ives most of all, who might, after all, have turned out to be her own true nephew by the strangest of chances, though I suspect the registry will show her fears were mistaken on that particular point, and that the true in birth she found was some other woman's entirely, a coincidence of name and year that frightened her far more than the facts truly warranted. But I think she could not bring herself to a plain, honest confession, because plain honesty was not a thing her nature knew how to manage. So she dressed the confession up as a picnic, and packed a glass for a ghost, and meant to torment her guests a little on the way to whatever truth she meant to tell them, and in doing so, she tormented one witness she never knew was listening at all, and paid for the whole of her life's small cruelties with the very last one she ever committed. She finished a row, and looked up at the inspector with an expression that was, for once, entirely without its usual mild good humour. "I find," she said, that I am rather more sorry for everyone in this business than I am glad to have solved it, Inspector. And that is, I think generally, the truest sign that one has got to the bottom of a very human sort of wickedness, rather than a merely clever one. Chapter 24. Aftermath at Little Hexworth. The Horticultural Society held its flower show that September as it always had. A little subdued, a little smaller, but held nonetheless, because villages, Miss Marple reflected, watching the sweet peas being judged beneath a sky gone soft with early autumn, have a way of closing over their wounds like water over a dropped stone, leaving barely a ripple to mark where the trouble went in. Dr. Haverford had been quietly, sorrowfully arrested and would, everyone understood, plead to manslaughter rather than murder, the provocation of Ottilie Vane's own cruelty weighing, Craddock privately believed, heavily enough in his favour that no jury in the county would send a well-loved country doctor to the gallows for a single moment's broken restraint after 11 years of patient, unspoken grief. He had asked, before he was taken from the village, whether he might be permitted to visit his sister's grave one last time, and Craddock, against every strict rule of his profession, had walked him there himself and stood a little apart, while the doctor knelt a long while in the grass, saying nothing that Craddock could hear, or was meant to. Colonel Fenwick had confessed his mismanagement of the Society's funds to a new and rather less forgiving committee, and was making slow, humiliating, but honest restitution, a field at a time. Dolly Fenwick, who had feared far worse for her husband than a slow repayment, was heard about the village, saying that she had never in her life been so grateful for so ordinary a punishment. Iris Delacourt, cleared entirely and rather disappointed to find herself no longer an object of the inspector's interest, had taken up the secretaryship of the Flower Show Committee with an energy that suggested 20 years of thwarted ambition finally finding a modest outlet. Beryl Hutton had been made chairwoman in Ottilie Vane's place, an appointment that struck the whole village on reflection as a small and fitting piece of justice 22 years overdue, and one of her first acts in the post was to have her Aunt Constance's name added, at last, to the honours board in the church hall, from which it had been quietly omitted for over 2 decades. And Peter Vane, whose aunt's estate had proved, once the lawyers finished with it, a good deal smaller and more encumbered than anyone had supposed, had taken a position at Walter Ives's nursery, the 2 young men having discovered, in the strange sympathy of near misses, that they preferred each other's honest company to the memory of the woman who had so nearly and so needlessly tried to make strangers of them both. The registry search, when it finally came through in October, showed exactly what Miss Marple had privately suspected. And Ottilie Trewin had indeed been born in a Cornish parish the same year as Ottilie Marchant, but to an entirely unconnected family, the coincidence of name and date nothing more than the ordinary cruelty of chance, magnified beyond all reason by a frightened woman's guilty conscience into a fear that had, in the end, cost her her life all the same. "It is curious," Miss Marple said to the vicar's wife, as they walked home together from the flower show in the mellow September light, "how very little most wickedness has to do with cleverness, in the end, and how very much it has to do with plain unhappiness left too long unattended. I have found it again and again, in one village or another, over a great many years now. People imagine that a murderer must be a monster of cunning, when so very often he is only an ordinary, kindly man who has carried a private grief so long and so quietly that when it finally breaks its banks, it takes him quite as much by surprise as anyone." "Do you think Dr. Haverford is truly sorry?" the vicar's wife asked. "I think," said Miss Marple, "that he has been sorry every single day since, and will go on being sorry every day for the rest of his life, which is very much its own sort of sentence, whatever the courts decide to add to it. And I think Ottilie Vane, wherever she is, might be a little sorry too, if she is able to look back honestly upon the small unkindnesses that filled up so much of her days, though I confess I have never been entirely persuaded that the dead are granted such useful reflections. That is rather more the living's burden, I find, and none the lighter for it. They walked on together in companionable silence, past the willows where a picnic basket had once been packed for four, and where, this quiet September afternoon, there was nothing more troubling to be seen than a pair of moorhens paddling placidly upon the stream, entirely indifferent to the small, sad human history the village would carry, in its own patient way, for years to come.